Good morning, adventurers. My name is Ben, and welcome to a morning show where I sit around, drink some tea, and talk about D&D. So first up today, we do not have any D&D news today. However, we are now still about a month out from the release of Strixhaven, a curriculum of chaos. So be sure to go check that out and get your pre-orders in if that is something that you are looking forward to getting. Yeah, that sentence kind of made sense. Definitely go check it out. Make sure you order from your local game shop if you can. Otherwise, you can order from most places on the internet. Um, Moving on from news, we have streams today. We have the C Team at twitch.tv/DND at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. So if you've been keeping up with that one, go check that out. That is all of the streams that I have for Tuesday. So, again, if you know of any streams that I should be plugging on this show, please let me know, and I will add them to the rotation and to the list, and we will get moving from there and see what else I can add, because I again would like to build out sort of like this full catalog so that I could have plenty of options for people, help plug smaller streams, etc., etc. For T&D today, we are moving through the intro today. I have my Rooster mug. I don't really know why I chose it today. I just kind of did. And I'm a little bit stiff from not moving a whole lot yesterday. So I've got some Tension Tamer from Celestial Seasonings to hopefully help loosen me out just a little bit. I know it's more of like a brain tension kind of thing, which could use that a little bit too. But I'm hoping that moving around some more today, because I feel a lot better after the booster yesterday. Get your booster shots. Hopefully that'll help, get me back to normal. Anyway, moving into what we are actually talking about today. I want to talk about using passive ability scores today. So on your character sheet, there is a section called, there's a section below your ability scores that is labeled passive perception. This is a box where you fill in 10 plus your perception modifier to give yourself your passive perception. But that is the only place any passive skill is presented on your character sheet. If you're using D&D Beyond, they also present you with passive investigation and passive insight. And the alert feat, nope, not the alert feat, the observant feat gives you +5 to your passive perception and your passive investigation. But those are really the only times that any sort of passive skill is like essentially loaded into a character sheet. It's the only time that they are mentioned in a character creation process. It is the only time that they are handed to you in any real capacity. So what is the deal with passive scores then? As I mentioned with passive perception, a passive score just in general is going to be 10 plus your modifier for that skill. And the idea behind a passive score is that you're not trying. It is your dead average of whatever you would get. So the average on a D20 is going to be 10-ish. Your average on a D20 for all intents and purposes is going to be 10. So if you were to just take 10 plus your modifier, that gets you where you need to be. If you've played the Kids On games, Kids on Bikes, Kids on Brooms, it's similar to the mechanic where you can take half and succeed if you are good enough at a skill to take half, add your modifiers, and then succeed on a task. I have begun using passive scores more and more recently, in that while yes, it is a lot of fun for players to just be able to roll dice, it's not always necessary, right? Like the rogue who has reliable talent and a +13 or something in his Thieves' Tool proficiency is going to be able to make it through a DC 20 lock, definitely a DC 15 lock. So what's the point of even having him roll for that? Sometimes it's just to see how high the number can go, and that's always fun. Other times it's like, well, okay, go ahead and roll. The lowest you can get is a 23, so I guess we're just going to sit here and go, wow, and be amazed, and that's it. So it's really just about um, expediting the process a little bit. You don't have to stop and wait for somebody to do math if their passive average would beat out what the actual difficulty class of the check is. So this can be applied in a lot of different ways. If you are a hulking figure, somebody who's really, really big, and you use your strength for intimidation checks all the time, which we'll talk about alternate ability score things in just a second here. But if you use your strength for intimidation checks, but you don't have like triple proficiency in it or whatever, and you roll a 2 to be intimidating, that doesn't really add up, because if you're trying to loom over a halfling who is two feet tall and not an adventurer, because you average out to being like a 10 then, as opposed to the 18 that you would get from just having proficiency and having a high strength score. So it helps mitigate that like failure for no reason kind of thing. I don't obviously I don't use passive checks for everything, because that would be silly. Oftentimes the players are actively trying to do something, but in using a passive check, you actually can like help circumvent a couple of the different things, and it helps people actually feel like they are filling their role within the party. Passive perception is the one that comes up most often, though, because people don't know that they are actively looking for things sometimes. And so when you're like, oh, your passive perception tells you, they go, oh, wait, that's right. I can look for stuff all the time. And so if somebody has a passive perception of 21 and they're walking past somebody with a stealth check of 20, or there's something that requires a DC 20 perception check to get, and they just sort of pick up on it, that is a reward for having invested in that skill, in spite of the fact that they're not actively using that skill. A similar sort of thing goes for rogues. I say rogues, dexterity-based characters generally, before they get something like reliable talent, where they're going to be a baseline of sneaky, just sort of in general, right? Like, if a character has a passive perception of 15 and they have a +7 modifier to stealth, just like existing, they are naturally going to be sneakier than these other things, unless circumstances change that for some reason. So you might want to use a passive stealth check at that point. I am not of the camp that thinks that passive, if you roll below what your passive skill would be, you should automatically sub in what your passive skill would be, because obviously when you're actively trying to do something, you are focused on it, and there is going to be a variable result to something that you just kind of like do automatically. And so obviously don't sub that in. I know personally several DMs that do that, and I think it's very weird, because it just gives everybody reliable talent then. But that's not really the point. Let's see, what is next? Oh, last thing I will mention on the passive skill stuff, there is actually a section in Chapter 7 of the Player's Handbook that tells you about passive skills. It's super short, which is why nobody ever really remembers it. And it mentions in there that if you were to have advantage or disadvantage on the check given the circumstance, even if you are not actively making the check, you get a +or-5 modifier to what it is that you are rolling. So if you were to have advantage on one of these checks, given the circumstances, but you're not actively rolling, but the DM is trying to like calculate that in their head, you would get a +5. If you would have disadvantage, you would get a -5. That helps make it a little bit more of a dynamic thing, given favorable or not so favorable circumstances, which I think is very, very useful. Again, DMs caution not to use this so much that it really just like takes all of the control out of your players' hands, because you want them to actually enjoy rolling dice and playing the game, because the mechanics of the game are rolling dice and role playing, and that's it. That's not true. That's not it. But you get the idea of what I'm saying. You don't want to strip them of the joy of a huge part of the game, but it does help streamline the story. It is particularly good for roleplay based games where a full stop to roll a die for whatever reason in the middle of a like confrontational scene might really sort of take it out for you. might take the players out of the moment for you. That's what I mean. So let's talk a little bit about using alternative ability scores for a second here, because this is one that I think so many people forget about, and I really like it. It's hard to explain to people if they aren't familiar with D&D mechanics, but it also is a very, very useful thing, because the way that 5th edition is set up, they have all of these skills laid out for you, and they have them set up in such a way that makes it so that they are tied to a core ability score. And most of the time, that is what you want to use it for, obviously. However, there are some times where it just simply doesn't make sense. The example that I used before of being a giant individual who is just rippling muscles. Let's say you like break a table on a door frame or something with one hand to try and intimidate somebody. The DM has you roll intimidation, but your charisma is a -1, whereas your strength is a +5. And you have proficiency in intimidation, so that brings it up to like a +2. However, you still only roll like a 13 because you're not using an ability score that is any good for you. But you clearly did not just use your charisma there to try and actually intimidate this other person. You used your strength and you like beat the table against the thing. So the way that alternative ability scores for skill checks works, if you are unsure, is that you check to see if you are proficient with a skill. If you are, you add your proficiency bonus to a check made using the core ability score. So in that specific example, normally you would make a charisma based check for intimidation plus proficiency if you were proficient in that skill. You do the exact same thing, except you use a strength based check plus proficiency if you are proficient in intimidation, because you're using your strength to intimidate as opposed to your charisma. And this is something that DMs can decide on the fly. It is fun now and again to just toss in a weird one and let people just be confused by what you're doing, but there is oftentimes a lot of like very good reason behind why you would do this specific alternative kind of check. Let's see. One that doesn't come up a lot, and by doesn't come up a lot, I mean people don't realize it often, I feel like, is that actually tying knots in, like tying a complicated knot for something, I believe is supposed to be an intelligence sleight of hand check to remember the knot, but also like have the dexterity in your hands to actually tie the thing, which is an interesting combination, but it also does make sense to me at least, and I would think that it makes sense to a decent number of people, enough to where that I believe I have seen posted several times over, what people saying that is what that is supposed to be. Similar, it follows the same sort of logic as to why you can have different tool checks using the same tools have different ability scores associated with them. A good example of that. This isn't really a spoiler for Campaign 1 a Critical Role at all. It just kind of happens over a bunch of times throughout it. Is whenever Percy is making a Tinkerer's Tools check, sometimes Matt has him use Intelligence, sometimes he has him use Dexterity, and I think a couple of times he might even have him use Strength. Because it depends upon what he is trying to do with those tools in order to actually make whatever the thing that he is trying to make is. And so this is where combining that with the passive scores gets a little funky, but is also not necessarily a bad thing. Just you kind of have to get a feel for how characters normally would be in order to be able to really do that. Because let's say you're playing a bard who is very, very not dexterous, but has obviously high charisma, that sort of thing. Maybe instead of making stealth checks using dexterity, because they're not like actively sneaking through, they're making stealth checks to essentially impersonate someone else, in such a way that allows them to blend into the crowd. Normally that would be a deception kind of check, but I could easily see it being argued that that needs to be a stealth check instead. And honestly, if a player comes to me as the DM and says, I want to use charisma for my stealth skill, I would have them say, or tell me why is that the way that you want to do it? And they would explain it to me, and if they were like, okay, well, I'm not trying to hide, I am trying to blend in using my performative abilities, or my ability to like undermine expectations or whatever it is, and if they make a decent case for it, I'll go, yeah, okay, we'll see how this goes, and we can move from there. Obviously, there are going to be different sort of consequences for straying from like your average stealth check, because you're not hidden, you're still in the public eye, but that's something that has to be dealt with in the moment. Yeah, in using passive scores with alternative abilities, you have to get a vibe for how players are going to be playing on average. Passive intimidation, using that character that is beefy and huge, would be using their strength score predominantly, because most of the time that they're going to be trying to intimidate people is probably going to be using their strength score. So they would need, their passive would then be 10 plus their intimidation modifier using their strength score. So it'd be 10 plus strength plus proficiency if they are proficient in intimidation, which is interesting to me. It's cool, it's fun, it's interesting. So I really encourage people using both passive scores and alternative ability scores. Using alternative ability scores can lead to some really, really interesting like character moments, like dynamic sort of moments, because you are going outside of the very specific, very sort of like structured set, essentially, that they have laid out for you in that ability score table, or the skill table. Again, it is largely a very, very well done skill table. They make a lot of sense with the skills that they are associated with, but sometimes it doesn't line up quite right. The one that comes up most often, honestly, again, is the intimidation thing. But that's not really the point. You can use other stuff for other things. But that is everything that I have to talk to you guys about today. Thank you so much for tuning in and making me part of your morning routine. I really do appreciate it. And thank you so much to my patrons. You guys are the ones that really do make this show possible. If you are able to and interested in supporting the show, there's a link to my Patreon in the description of this video. I really, really appreciate all of the support that I am getting already, and would definitely appreciate any more that comes my way. That is everything. And so I will find a more graceful way to dismount at some point here from an episode. But until next time, I will see you guys tomorrow, and keep on rolling.